Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doug Swanson. I'm Visitor Services Manager for the National Archives Experience, and I want to welcome you all to the McGowan Theater for another of our noontime lecture programs. Today's topic is The Making of a Patriot, Benjamin Franklin at the Cockpit by Sheila Skemp. This program is also being presented in conjunction with our Benjamin Franklin exhibit, which is on display right now in the O'Brien Gallery on the exhibit level. Dr. Skemp is the Marquette Chair in American History at the University of Mississippi. She teaches classes on colonial and revolutionary America, women and gender, and the American dream. She's the author of a number of books and articles dealing with William and Benjamin Franklin. Among her published works are First Lady of Letters, Judith Sargent Murray, and the Struggle for Women's Rights, and William Franklin, Son of a Patriot, Servant of a King. She was named the university's Outstanding Teacher in Liberal Arts in 1985 and received its Faculty Achievement Award in Outstanding Teaching and Scholarship in 2009. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sheila Skemp to the National Archives.
And thank you all for being here and giving up your lunch to hear about the always, to my mind at least, intriguing Benjamin Franklin and the event that I argue led him to become a leader in American struggle for independence. I would imagine, because this is usually the case, that there are a lot of people in this room who have a long and abiding interest in Benjamin Franklin. Everywhere I go, I meet people who call themselves FOFs, Friends of Franklin. I even met a very charming man in Philadelphia who wanders the streets of the city dressed as Benjamin Franklin. And he knows just about as much about Benjamin Franklin as any published scholar does. I imagine there are people here who have read about Benjamin Franklin and maybe have been reading about him long before I started researching him and publishing about him back in the 1980s. So I might not be able to tell you anything new, but I'm going to try. Benjamin Franklin is, to my mind, fascinating, ever contradictory. We tend to think of him as the most accessible of the founders. He's down to earth, he's human. We can imagine, sitting down with him at our favorite pub, drinking a few glasses of ale, talking and laughing for an hour or two in ways that you just could not imagine doing, say, with George Washington, who always seems to be a marble statue draped in a toga. He's one of us, or so it seems. And yet, the more you read about him, to my mind, the more fascinating and the more difficult he is to pin down, the harder he is to characterize. My book indicates, or argues at least, that there are a couple of things about him that people don't always think about when they think of Franklin. First, although he was proud of his ability to compromise, and we always think of him as somebody who can turn away anger with a smile and a joke, he could be quite genial, but he could also be desperately, implacably your foe if he ever decided to count you among his enemies. Another thing I think that we tend to forget is that, yes, eventually, he became one of America's most staunchest supporters of independence. In fact, it took him a long time to get to that point. I will argue today that it was his experience at something called the Cockpit, which I'll talk about shortly, that made him England's implacable foe and made him into a patriot. So, my book itself focuses deeply on this one incident, Benjamin Franklin's humiliation at the Cockpit, and then it analyzes from various perspectives the meaning of that incident, both for Franklin and for America itself. Today, what I want to do is to narrow my scope just a little bit. And instead of talking about all the ways that this incident is linked to larger issues, I'm going to simply tell the story. Tell the story of Franklin's appearance at the cockpit, an appearance that lasted a little bit less than an hour, but an incident that I think changed everything for Franklin. So I'm going to simply tell you what happened, what led up to it, and what its consequences to Franklin were. So first, what happened at the cockpit and why? Franklin entered a tiny room, tinier than this room is today, in Whitehall Palace that was known as the Cockpit on January 29th, 1774. The room was built by Henry VIII, and he used it to stage cockfights, which is why it became known as the Cockpit. Long since that was no longer the case. The government used it to conduct normal official business, but the old name stuck. And I always think that when Franklin walked out of that little room, a little less than an hour after he entered it, he must have thought, you know, it's returned to its original purpose. And I, not some unlucky barnyard fowl, had just endured a ritual sacrifice at the hands of a government that he had once loved. Franklin's appearance, physical appearance that day, was not designed to impress. He had a very old-fashioned wig on and wore a simple blue coat of Manchester velvet. He entered the room, he looked around, and he realized that all the seats were taken. And so the 68-year-old man was forced to stand as a man young enough to be his son harangued and berated him to the delight of an overthrow crowd for about an hour. Everybody who was anybody was there to watch Franklin be humiliated. Lord North was there. General Thomas Gage also managed to make it. Even the stray scientist or philosopher was squeezed into the room. Most members of the prestigious Privy Council were also there. Significantly, I think crucially, Franklin knew most of these people personally. He had hoped to be one of them. He counted them among his friends. And so from the beginning, this was personal for him as well as political. Why was he there? Ostensibly, he came to defend a petition from the Massachusetts legislature asking for the removal of two men from office, Governor Thomas Hutchinson and Lieutenant Governor Andrew Oliver. Franklin was there as an agent, which is kind of like a lobbyist for Massachusetts, and he knew when he walked in that this petition was going to be rejected. In fact, he was surprised that he even had to show up. But it was his job to go through the motions, defend it if he could, and so he was there in that capacity. Two things made what under any other circumstances would have been a mere formality into a spectacle that captured the attention of everybody in London. First, the timing could not have been worse. Franklin had been originally prepared to defend the petition on January 11th. But when he found out on January 11th that Governor Hutchinson had hired a lawyer to defend him, he thought, well, maybe I should get a lawyer to defend me too. And so he asked for a postponement. Unfortunately for him, he got it. And so instead of defending the petition on January 11th, he defended it on January 29th. 18 days. 18 days meant, in this case, a lot, because it turned out that on January 20th, just 9 days before he appeared at the cockpit, London received word about what we now know as the Boston Tea Party. Had he gone on the original date, January 11th, he would have gotten there before news of the Boston Tea Party arrived. Rightly or wrongly, English leaders were furious at the Boston Tea Party. To them, this was the last straw. They had done, from their standpoint, everything that they could to be conciliatory toward the colonists for 10 years. And this was the thanks that they got. A bunch of Boston ruffians had thrown private property into the ocean and had shown that they had no respect for England, its laws, or its lawmakers. They were hurt, they were angry, they were frustrated, they were out for blood. They were looking for someone, anyone, to blame for the ills that beset the English Empire. And Benjamin Franklin was a convenient target. But why Franklin? He clearly had no control over the men who destroyed the tea. In fact, when he first heard about it, he was furious and said, "Why did they do this?" He was not pleased at all. So why Franklin? Franklin himself was partly to blame, which brings us to our second reason for what happened in that room. To understand this, you have to go back a little bit and look at some background. Between 1768 and 1769, Thomas Hutchinson and Andrew Oliver had written occasional letters to a man by the name of Thomas Whately. Whately was a member of Parliament. He was a supporter of the Stamp Act. Both Oliver and Hutchinson had been victims of mob violence during the Stamp Act riots. Their houses had been destroyed. Their most prized possessions had been ground into the dust. They had barely escaped with their lives. 3 years later, for some reason, they were still angry. And so in letter after letter to Whately, they talked about the mob violence that characterized Boston. And they insisted over and over again, England must clamp down on the colonies before it was too late. Otherwise, independence would be inevitable. Thomas Whately died in 1772, but the Hutchinson-Oliver letters survived. And in the winter of 1772, someone, Franklin never told anybody who, historians still don't know who it was, somebody got possession of those letters, gave them to Franklin, and said, "Do with them what you will." And Franklin forwarded the letters to Thomas Cushing, who was Speaker of the House in Massachusetts. And he sent a letter with it, and he said, "There has lately fallen into my hands part of a correspondence that I have reason to believe laid the foundation of all of our present grievances." Franklin's explanation for his decision to send the letters back to Massachusetts has been, people just still shake their heads at it. This is supposed to be a smart guy. What was he thinking? He said, and he never stopped saying this, he thought that when people saw these letters, that they would feel the same way that he had. He said when he saw them, light dawned. Everything suddenly made sense. Now he knew why King and Parliament were so determined to destroy colonial liberties, which he just couldn't figure out before. Parliament's efforts to tax the colonies, the government's decision to send redcoats to Boston in 1768, which led to the Boston Massacre, came because people like Hutchinson and Oliver had intentionally misled London officials, lying to them, convincing them that they should act arbitrary measures, measures that they never would have even considered had they been thinking of these things on their own. As a result, Franklin said triumphantly, my own resentment disappeared overnight. And he assumed somehow that when Cushing and his cohorts read the letters, they too would lay the blame where it ought to lie, and by that means effect a reconciliation. He thought sending these letters would bring England and America closer together. It was about as wrong a prognostication as anybody has ever made. Franklin sent the letters to the Speaker, and he urged him not to publish them, and only to show them to people he called men of worth in the province, people whose discretion he could touch. But of course, news of the documents leaked out right away. Wild rumors about them spread. Hutchinson and Oliver were burned in effigy throughout the colonies. The pressure to print the letters was intense. And on June 15th, Cushing finally did just that. For those of you old enough to remember about either the Pentagon Papers or the Watergate tapes and the reaction that people had to those, think of that when you think of the reaction people had to the letters of Hutchinson and Oliver once they saw what was in them. Immediately, the Massachusetts legislature drew up a petition asking the king to remove the governor and lieutenant governor from their offices. It was an audacious demand. I mean, these people served at the discretion of the king. This was not a democracy. It wasn't going to happen. But they nevertheless sent this petition to London, and it was this petition that Franklin was trying to defend at the Cockpit. In the beginning, only a handful of people knew that it was Franklin who sent the letters to Cushing. But in December of 1773, Thomas Whately's brother William challenged a man by the name of John Temple to a duel because he thought John Temple was the one who sent the letters to Franklin. Neither man was hurt, so they decided they were going to have another duel, and Franklin finally, on Christmas Eve of 1773, less than a month before his appearance at the Cockpit, put an advertisement in a local paper and said, "I hope to prevent further mischief, and therefore," he said, "I alone have obtained and transmitted to Boston the letters in question." Once he did that, all of London was abuzz. Franklin's enemies, and he had some, had a field day. Newspapers attacked his character in every way possible. He was, they said, dishonest, immoral, one of the most determined enemies of the welfare and prosperity of Great Britain. And so when he walked into the Cockpit, Franklin encountered the perfect storm. The king's men were furious about the Tea Party. They were furious about Franklin's use of the Hutchinson-Oliver letters. They had put two and two together, and they had come to the conclusion that it was Franklin's fault that the relationship between Massachusetts and England was so bad. He was to blame for the petition. He was even to blame for the Boston Tea Party. Still, even though he knew that people were mad, Franklin was not ready for what happened to him in the Cockpit. One man stood up to defend Hutchinson and Oliver. His name was Alexander Wedderburn. He was the Attorney General of the King. He was known everywhere for his ability to use words as weapons. He was an orator par excellence, and he was never in better form. Franklin later on called this a bull baiting. General Gage said, "Wedderburn was serious, pathetic, and severe by turns. No man's conduct and character was ever before so mangled and torn as Dr. Franklin's was at this time." And it was the attack on Franklin, not a defense of Hutchinson, which he hardly even mentioned, that was at the heart of Wedderburn's performance. Franklin, he said, was the leader of a secret cabal whose members were determined to destroy the empire. Franklin was the first mover and prime conductor, the inventor and first planner. He was a true incendiary who had intentionally set the whole province in flame. He had used fraudulent and corrupt means to discredit Thomas Hutchinson before the naive, innocent, well-meaning farmers of Massachusetts, pulling the wool over the eyes of common, ordinary colonists who had no idea they were being used by a man who he said had forfeited all the respect of society and of men. On and on he went. I've just picked a few of the worst things he said. I mean, it just went on just forever, it seemed like, I'm sure, especially to Franklin. By any standard, it was a spectacular performance. The audience loved it. They hooted, they applauded, as Wedderburn, in one man's words, poured forth such a torrent of virulent abuse on Dr. Franklin as no man had ever endured before. And through it all, Franklin stood, said nothing, didn't even allow his facial expression to change. He thought that a common criminal would not have been subject to the treatment he received at the Cockpit. Finally, it was over. Wedderburn sat down. He invited his victim to respond. Franklin simply said, "I do not choose to be examined." And there was nothing more to say, and he walked out of the room. And as he walked out, he looked at everybody gathered around Wedderburn, congratulating him on his brilliant performance, shaking his hand, slapping him on the back. No one in that room seemed to understand what they had just done. They had turned a loyal English subject into a patriot in less than an hour's time. In short order, the Privy Council rejected the Massachusetts petition, which they could have and should have done without any of this grand display. 2 days later, Franklin was fired from his position as the King's deputy postmaster of the American colonies, a position he'd had for 2 decades. On his own, he resigned his position as Massachusetts agent, knowing full well that whatever use he had been to the colony was at an end. He was now a private man with no one to serve, no job to do. It's impossible to overstate the significance of Franklin's humiliation at the Cockpit. It was devastating. He was a proud and loyal Empire man, and now he was a committed patriot. At the time, he tried to pretend that it didn't matter. He said, "I've not lost a single friend as a result of this. People are coming to my rooms every day and telling me that they still support me and that they're indignant at the unworthy treatment that I received." He told his sister Jane that he was proud that he had lost his post office job. This was a badge of honor. He said that he never tried to defend himself, but just kept a cool, sullen silence. That wasn't exactly true. He almost immediately began to compose a document in his own defense. He never finished it, he never published it, but what we do have of it indicates a man that was furious at his own humiliation. I don't think it's an accident that on the day he signed the Franco-American Treaty of Alliance in 1778, he put on that same suit of Manchester velvet to sign the peace treaty. It was like he was saying, "You got me then, I've got you now." So, what do we make of this incident? Why does it matter? A few points. First, and most importantly perhaps, it should remind us that Franklin, like the vast majority of colonists, at least those whose names are not Patrick Henry or Samuel Adams, was a very reluctant patriot. We all tend to think of Franklin as the quintessential American, and we assume, as my students would say, that it was a no-brainer for him to become a patriot. Not true. His path to independence was a long and tortured one, as it was for most Americans. Even firebrands like Adams and Henry left England with considerable fear and a great deal of sadness, and most, like Franklin, were more reluctant still. Granted, Franklin's conversion to independence was earlier, more dramatic, more sudden, and more thoroughgoing than it was for most men. But I think that's because few men loved England as much as Franklin did before the Cockpit. Benjamin Franklin was not a provincial man. As a young boy, he had lived in England for 18 mostly pleasurable months when he was still trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. He returned in 1757, remained in London 5 more years. This time, he came not as a bewildered boy trying to find his way in the big city, but as a man whose intellectual credentials had dazzled men of letters throughout Western Europe. He'd already conducted his famous kite experiment, becoming known everywhere as the man who tamed the lightning. He'd been admitted to London's prestigious Royal Society, an honor few Englishmen and even fewer Americans were ever able to attain. And once in England, he was wined and dined and feted and celebrated everywhere he went. It's not surprising that when he finally left for home in 1762, he wasn't very happy about it. He might have missed his wife and daughter, though I sometimes wonder, but he promised one London friend, he said, "I will return, and this time I will settle here forever." He got back home, and he still missed London. He told more than one person, Pennsylvania, even Philadelphia, is a provincial backwater. It just doesn't compare to the big city. And so he was delighted when less than 2 years after he got back to Philadelphia for the second time, he returned to England once more. He went there, ironically, to try to get the king to turn Pennsylvania into a royal colony. This at the very time when the Stamp Act was just going into effect. So the irony there, to my mind, is rather amazing. Franklin loved England, not just because of the friends he had, not just because of the honors he received, not just because of the stimulating conversations he enjoyed there, but because he had devoted most of his adult life to the service of king and country. Just a few examples. He'd helped raise money for the king's army during the French and Indian War. He'd used his influence to secure a job as royal governor of New Jersey for his son William. He'd worked long and hard and ultimately fruitlessly to make Pennsylvania a royal colony. He had made excuses over and over and over again for king and parliament when the government enacted the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, earning himself enemies in Pennsylvania as a result. He steadily sought to become a member of the king's government, to get a more important position than that post office job. At times, he thought he was close to getting the position, but in the end, and definitely after the Cockpit, he knew that all of his efforts were for nothing. He did all this and more, not just because he was an ambitious man, though I think he was a very ambitious man, but because he really and truly believed that Englishmen on both sides of the water would benefit from seeing themselves, as he put it, not as belonging to different communities with different interests, but as one community with one interest. He wanted an Anglo-American alliance based upon equality that would be, as he put it, the awe of the world. And so he was a real English patriot up until almost the end. Whenever Franklin thought about England, he thought about the king. And he was a royalist throughout the 1760s and into the 1770s. At George III's coronation, he lavished praise on the king. Never, he said, has England had a better prince, and he predicted that the king's reign would be both happy and glorious. As late as 1770, the year of the Boston Massacre, he was urging the colonists to maintain a steady loyalty to the king and claimed that George had the best disposition toward us and has a family interest in our prosperity. It was not until the Cockpit that Franklin reluctantly and publicly turned against the king. If he loved the king in particular, he loved England in general. He was completely at home in London. And not surprisingly, he moved in really, really august circles. He knew personally many of the men whom political leaders at home were saying were trying to destroy American liberty. And he would say, yeah, a few of them maybe. There were some of them that he did despise, no doubt about that. But he also knew, because he was there, and he knew these people personally and didn't just know about them from rumors spread across the Atlantic Ocean, he knew that there were many, many friends of America in England, and he knew that most others were not out to destroy colonial liberty. They might have been misguided. They might have been stubborn. Some of them, he admitted, were not very bright, but they were not evil. Thus, even when he was frustrated by government policy, Franklin was always hopeful. The popular inclination here, he would say confidently, is to wish us well and that we may preserve our liberties. Benjamin Franklin changed his tune after 1774. He was never again the same. For the first time, he said, I am at a loss to know how peace and union is to be maintained or restored between the different parts of the empire. He was especially furious because he said, I gave the ministers a chance to change everything on a silver platter. If they had only used these letters to say, we didn't know, we were lied to, everything could have been changed. They might have thanked me, he said tersely. Instead, they chose to abuse me, and that he could not forgive. After the Cockpit, Franklin's mood darkened perceptibly. His vision changed in a variety of ways. Let me just give you a couple of quick examples, kind of the before and after picture. Before the Cockpit, he laughed when he heard people like Samuel Adams and Patrick Henry say that the king and his ministers were the masterminds of an insidious plot to destroy colonial liberty. He said, this is paranoid. I know these people. This is not true. They respect us. They love our liberties. Again, they make a mistake now and then, but this does not mean evil intention. After January of 1774, Franklin said, the men who hold the reins of power in England look at Americans with total disdain. If somebody like Wedderburn could sneer at him, a world-renowned scientist, a man of letters, a talented man, what must he think of ordinary Americans? If ministers who had once told him that they thought he deserved a position in the government were laughing uproariously at Wedderburn's jibes, how could Franklin cling to the belief that Englishmen would ever join the colonies in this pan-empirical empire that would be the envy of the world? So his own treatment made him realize, or think at least, that Englishmen looked down at colonists everywhere. Or another example, look at his attitude toward English morality. In the past, he had always defended the virtue of the English. He always talked about how moral they were, how good they were, and people at home would say, the English, they're dissipate, they're luxury-loving, and he'd say, no. I mean, a few of them are, but it's not that bad. Now, after 1774, he attacked their manners and morals from the rooftops. Aspiring members of Parliament, he said, regularly bought or bribed their way into seats of power. The king's ministers were dissipate in corruption. If we don't leave the empire, he kept saying, English habits will inevitably corrupt and poison us. Corruption was evidently catching, and it went all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. Objectively, England was no more corrupt in 1775 than it had been 10 years earlier. England had not changed. Benjamin Franklin had. His humiliation at the Cockpit was a critical encounter for Benjamin Franklin. Had his ordeal not occurred when and how it did, he may have remained in England after 1775, still haunting Whitehall's corridors, talking, cajoling, offering one proposal after another, doing his best to preserve the empire, doing, as he said, and everything he could to explain England to America and America to England. He definitely would not have been in a hurry to leave London. His wife was dead. Most of his friends were dead as well. Many times he said, I might go home, but if I do go, I won't know anybody. I'm going to be a stranger among strangers. He'd lived in London for 10 years, had a lot of friends. He would have left London much later than he did. If the Cockpit incident changed Benjamin Franklin, pushing him toward a decision that he'd been trying to avoid, it's interesting, at least, to ask what would have been different for Franklin or for the nation had events played out differently. Historians hate counterfactual history, and for good reason. I mean, you can't say, well, what if this had happened? Because it didn't, and it wasn't going to, and you can't change that reality. But it's tempting, nevertheless, or at least fun, to wonder what actually changed because of one event that occurred at one particular moment in time. I think, for starters, independence would have happened anyway. But, as Franklin's experience indicates, there were many moments between 1765 and 1776 when leaders on both sides of the Atlantic might have behaved differently, at least postponing independence, if not making it not happen. Real people living in their own world, facing their own problems, make choices. The choices, looking at it from hindsight, seem obvious, almost inevitable, but they were not so clear to the people who were actually making them. To these people, the future was not a foregone conclusion. Independence was not a foregone conclusion. It was open-ended and full of possibilities. Look at the small picture. Benjamin Franklin was not an incendiary before January 29th. His support for independence was not a foregone conclusion. At the very least, had it not been for his humiliation at the Cockpit, he might not have abandoned his stubborn quest for unity quite so soon. He might have become a patriot in the end, but if he had been a patriot, he would have been a late patriot, not an early one, and he would have left for home in 1776 with genuine sorrow. He would not have gone home as England's most angry foe. If he had returned as a reluctant patriot instead of an eager one, he might not have been trusted by the Samuel Adamses and Patrick Henrys of the world. Thus, he might not have been on that committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence. More importantly, he probably would not have been sent to France to negotiate a peace treaty with the French. He would have been distrusted, and we would have lost a great diplomat in the process. But he did come early, and he did come angry, and he was trusted, and so he was put on that committee, and he was sent to France to try to negotiate a treaty. I think it's also safe to say that the Cockpit incident could have played out differently, and it could have been avoided altogether. Just a few alternative scenarios, and I don't think any of these are especially far-fetched. What if Franklin had gotten a royal job, which he kept thinking he was going to get, and he always thought he deserved? Would his response have been different? What if the timing of the Cockpit incident had been different? He had publicly admitted that he was responsible for the publication of the Hutchinson-Oliver letters on December 24th, 1773, less than a month before the Cockpit. What if he had admitted this much earlier, which he could have? This would have given time for tempers to have cooled. What if he had done it after January 29th? Also possible. Then that would not have been an issue at all. And Wedderburn would have attacked the petition, but he would have had no reason to attack Franklin in particular. It was those letters that he went after in his oration. Or, yet another or, when he learned that Hutchinson had engaged Wedderburn to represent him, what if he had said, fine, not a problem, go ahead, let's have this on January 11th instead of January 29th. This would have been before the Tea Party, and as a result, the anger in that room would not have been so great. The petition would have been rejected, and Franklin would have walked out of that room saying, well, we were treated fairly, you win some, you lose some, and that would have been the end of that. What about the big picture? What about independence itself? Franklin always said independence was avoidable. He always said that England missed a number of golden opportunities to reconcile its differences with the colonies. Parliament, he said, might have listened to America's British friends, people like William Pitt, Edmund Burke, who said, okay, you have a right to tax the colonies, but don't do it. But they went ahead and taxed the colonies and made principled men on both sides of the Atlantic increasingly angry. Or Lord North could have heeded the advice of many people in Parliament who thought that he should find some pretext to get rid of the tax on imported tea. This was not a crazy thing. A lot of members of Parliament told North that he should do that. Without the tea tax, no Boston Tea Party. And without the Boston Tea Party, no coercive acts, and no particular anger at the Cockpit on January 29th. The government could have even done one thing that my students always say they should have done, but it just wasn't going to happen. Benjamin Franklin suggested it on more than one occasion. England could have granted the colonists token representation in Parliament. If that had happened, then there would have been no American claim that they were taxed without representation. They would have gotten rid of that excuse, that slogan, once and for all. And what would have happened if the government had reacted to the Hutchinson-Oliver letters the way Franklin thought they would, and made scapegoats of them and diffused rather than escalated tensions? It's probably true that the revolution was inevitable, even if people at the time, like Franklin, did not think that this was the case. Parliament was not willing to step down before a bunch of rebellious colonies. Americans thought it was unthinkable to submit to what they saw as enslavement. With or without Franklin's support, they would eventually have declared and won their independence. No one person, not even Benjamin Franklin, is indispensable. It's doubtful that the Continental Congress would have found an emissary as adept as Franklin to send to France. Franklin was a celebrated intellectual. He was a shrewd diplomat, the likes of which we have seldom seen since. But France had very good practical reasons for joining the American cause. And they might well have done it, probably would have done it, even without Franklin's cajoling. So America would have survived without Benjamin Franklin, as much as I think he would hate to think that that was the case. But I don't think Franklin would have done so well without America. He made more than his fair share of political mistakes over the year. My favorite chapter in my book is all about the mistakes that Benjamin Franklin made. And they were legion, and the very last one was sending these letters to Massachusetts thinking that this was going to solve all the problems and bring everybody together. Well, no. He was somebody who made mistake after mistake after mistake and somehow ended up landing on his feet. And he landed on his feet, I think, because he made one decision that allowed most observers then and especially now to forget all the other mistakes he ever made. He embraced independence. He was on the winning side. His poor son, William, was a loyalist and was on the losing side, and who but me has ever heard of William Franklin? But Benjamin Franklin made the right choice. In doing this, he has gone down in history as one of the most valuable members of the new nation's founding generation. And it was the Cockpit that made him make that decision when and how he did. Thank you very much. And we have time for questions, if anybody has any. And you should go to one of the mics, which I can't see because the lights are shining on me.
Thanks for your story. I really enjoyed hearing it. I do dispute your speculation that the slogan "taxation without representation" would have disappeared had England granted America some token representation. We Washingtonians know all about token representation, and we have not abandoned that slogan.
You even have a license plate to that effect, I think.
We print it publicly, yeah.
Yes.
My question is, Franklin was, he was a consummate diplomatist. He distinguished himself in that area in later years. Despite the Cockpit and what happened there and the ensuing revolution and his support for it and the resulting independence, did he retain any constructive ties with anybody that was in that room or anybody that was highly placed in London that, despite perhaps their participation or sympathy for the treatment he got, did he nevertheless, kind of behind the scenes, retain some kind of relationship with those people that served him well at all?
Not most of them. A few who were his friends. William Pitt, he did. Edmund Burke, he did. But these were people who were in the minority who actually had supported him and the colonial cause to begin with. But once he was your enemy, he was your enemy. Some of his very best friends in London, he cut off relationships with. In fact, he cut off relationships with his own son, who was a loyalist and not an Englishman. So he was, that was it as far as he was concerned. Yeah.
That was a great segue because that's what I wanted to ask you. Was the relationship between Benjamin Franklin and his son and the before and the after and then subsequently to his death?
It was, his son ended up in solitary confinement in a Connecticut jail for almost a year. Then he went to New York and he headed something called the Associated Board of Loyalists, which is, we would now call it a terrorist organization. Then when it became clear that England was going to lose the war, he went to London and lived in exile for the rest of his life. He tried to get his father to reconcile with him and wrote him a letter and said, okay, you won, I lost, I did what I thought was right, I would do it again, but now that it's over, can we resume our very affectionate relationship, which they had had up until 1776. And Benjamin Franklin wrote back basically and said, no, you hurt me too much. They met once briefly, conducted some business. Benjamin wrote him out of his will, and that was that. William, on the other hand, was, he was trying to write a biography of his father when he died. He had a granddaughter who, every time he looked at her, he would say, don't you think she looks like Ben? He was remained fond of his father, but Benjamin just cut him out entirely. Yeah. I
Thank
forgot
you
about
for,
this side of the room, I'm sorry.
thank you for writing your book. Do you think that Franklin, he traveled before the Cockpit, I think it was in the 1760s or early 1770s, he had traveled to Ireland, and he had seen how the English had dominated the Irish, and he saw how they had people, I think I've read where they were living in mud huts,
Yeah.
and they kept them very poor, and he had seen that they were keeping the manufacturing down and keeping the Irish economy down, and the British feared that, and he, in his mind, don't you agree that in the back of his mind, he thought that that could have happened to America early on before the Cockpit, and also the fact that his Ohio Land Company speculations never panned out. They never did anything, and he regretted that deeply. So did his son,
Yeah.
and also that a lot of his British. I'm just visualizing in the back of his mind when he went into the Cockpit. He knew that his son William was a royal governor, and we would consider him kind of a snob, or he didn't have the life that Ben Franklin had growing up. But Franklin was a leather apron man, and the British in that room kind of resented him for that.
Resented him for what?
For being a person who rose up from a tradesman and became wealthy and became a scientist. And I kind of think the men in the room resented Franklin for that fact. But also, those three things kind of led him on to, he realized that the American manufacturing was going to be held back. And that had a big play in what was going on in the Privy in the back of his mind when he was
He was an
standing.
Adam Smith kind of person and believed in so-called free trade. And that was a grievance, and that was something he disliked. And the Ireland experience really opened his eyes to what could happen. And he looked at America and said, we're much better off than this, but who knows? The land deals was definitely something that grated on his mind. But these were grievances that up until 1774, he kept thinking, we can work this out. We can be friends. I don't like a lot of what's happening. The person who was in charge of him not being able to get the land deals that he wanted was, in fact, one of the people that he counted among his enemies even before 1774. But he also had friends and people in government who supported the land deals. And as long as that was the case, he kept thinking, this can be worked out. It was after 1774, I think, that he just said, it can't be worked out. And so that was, the grievances were there. If the grievances had not been there, maybe that one experience wouldn't have been enough. But this was like the tipping point. But yeah, everything that you said is absolutely true.
Thank you.
Thank you.
His coat that he wore,
Yeah.
the Manchester blue coat, didn't he wear that when he signed the 1783 treaty?
I had thought that that was the case, and then I found out that it was the Franco-American alliance. But that's what I had always thought, too.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, thank you so much for coming and giving up your lunch.